Canada has signed 30 new partnerships with allied countries under the Critical Minerals Production Alliance. Ottawa says it'll bring in more than $12 billion for both mining and processing projects.
Amidst global uncertainty, Canada's Prime Minister has arrived in Canberra to forge a middle power alliance. In an historic address to Parliament, Mark Carney claimed a new partnership was necessary to protect against increasingly volatile superpowers like China, Russia and the United States.
Canada and Australia say they're going to work together on critical minerals. The Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, wants to strengthen ties with so-called middle power countries. He has said that global powers such as the US, well, you didn't name them, but he said global powers have resorted to new tactics of bullying smaller trading partners.
Canada and Australia did not just sign a cooperation agreement. They merged their strategic mineral reserves into a coordinated alliance that controls resources China desperately wants to monopolize and the United States assumed it would lead. And neither superpower saw this coming. Australia and Canada said they had signed new agreements on critical minerals as Prime Minister Mark Carney made a landmark address to the Australian Parliament. It is a sign of the developing bond between what diplomats call the middle powers. The phrase middle powers is diplomatic language. What it really means is countries powerful enough to matter globally, but not dominant enough to dictate terms alone. Until now, middle powers usually chose sides between superpowers. Canada and Australia just chose each other. Here's what they bring to the table together. Canada and Australia together produce about 1/3 of global lithium and uranium, as well as more than 40% of global iron ore. Read that again. 1/3 of the world's lithium, the critical material for every electric vehicle battery, every grid-scale energy storage system, and every portable electronic device. 1/3 of global uranium essential for nuclear power and nuclear weapons. 40% of iron ore, the foundation of steel production and industrial manufacturing. All now coordinated between two countries that just committed to aligning their mining strategies, stockpiles, and export policies. Anthony Albanese told a press conference that Australia would join Canada's G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance. We have agreed to deepen our relationship across several areas, building on our joint declaration of intent on critical minerals that we signed last year. Australia joining Canada's G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance is not symbolic, it is operational. The alliance pools capital coordinates, investments in mining projects, secures long-term purchase agreements with allied buyers, and explicitly builds supply chains outside Chinese control. And they are backing it with real money. Australia has already allocated $1.2 billion to build a critical minerals stockpile, beginning with antimony, gallium, and rare earths. That will now be more closely aligned with Canada's defense stockpiling regime that has a similar aim. National Stockpiles Defense aligned and coordinated between two countries on opposite sides of the Pacific. That is not just a trade partnership. That is a strategic resource cartel designed for geopolitical resilience. There is a lot Canada and Australia can do together on critical minerals, as producer nations Australian Resources Minister Madeleine King told Reuters ahead of Carney's visit. Producer nations, not consumer nations, negotiating for access. Producer nations with leverage deciding who gets access. That is a fundamental power shift. Prime Minister Mark Carney made the vision explicit when addressing Australia's parliament. Australia and Canada are middle powers in a world that is changing. We cannot change it back, but we can back ourselves, back our citizens, and back each other. Then he framed the economic foundation. We are both blessed in the abundant foundational metals that power the batteries, EVs, smartphones, fighter jets, and AI systems of this century. We are the world's critical mineral superpowers. Critical mineral superpowers, not potential, not emerging, but present tense. And they are not waiting for permission from Washington or Beijing to act like it. In a world of great power, rivalry, middle powers have a choice: compete for favor or combine for strength, Carney told lawmakers. Canada and Australia just chose strength together. Why does this partnership threaten both the US and China? Start with China. Western nations have been attempting to diversify their supply chains away from China, which still controls the majority of production and processing of critical minerals essential for semiconductors and defense applications. China's dominance over rare earth processing, estimated between 70% and over 90%, depending on the specific mineral, has been a strategic weapon. Beijing has used export controls, quotas, and supply restrictions to pressure countries politically and economically. The Canada-Australia alliance directly challenges that monopoly. If two democratic resource-rich nations coordinate mining expansion, processing capacity, and export policies, they create an alternative supply network that bypasses Chinese control entirely. Countries currently dependent on Chinese rare earths, such as Japan, South Korea, and European nations, now have a viable alternative supplier. That strips Beijing of leverage it has wielded for decades. But the United States has reasons to be uncomfortable too. In February, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance proposed a U.S.-led preferential trade bloc for critical minerals, a framework where Washington would anchor Western supply chains. But a month after that announcement, some countries started making different plans. Canada did not wait for U.S. leadership. Canada built its own framework, attracted allies, including France and Japan, and now added Australia, the other major Western producer. Canada believes the best way to address the issue of concentrated supply of critical minerals is through a production alliance or a buyer's club, rather than just a price floor. Energy and Mining Minister Tim Hodgson told Reuters, "That is a polite rejection of the US model. Washington wanted a trade bloc it would lead. Canada created a buyer's club where producer nations Canada and Australia coordinate with consumer nations Japan, France, and European allies on equal footing. The US is welcome to participate, but Washington does not lead it. Ottawa does. The integration between Canada and Australia goes far beyond mining. Australia and Canada will also deepen cooperation in areas including defense and maritime security, trade, and artificial intelligence. Defense cooperation includes the training of Canadian Armed Forces personnel on the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar System, which will begin in Australia in mid-2026, enabling Canada to better detect and deter threats across the personnel. Arctic. Canada is buying Australian radar technology and training Canadian forces on it in Australia. That is defense industrial integration. Canada and Australia are also committed to exploring mechanisms to facilitate the movement of defense equipment and personnel between the two countries while removing unnecessary barriers to operational collaboration by initiating discussions on establishing a status of forces agreement. A status of forces agreement is the legal framework that allows military forces to operate seamlessly in each other's territory. It is the type of agreement the US normally signs with close allies. Canada and Australia are now building that same level of integration with each other, independent of the US framework. For Washington, watching two close allies create parallel defense structures without American mediation is significant. The broader investment picture shows how serious this is. Canada and Australia announced the development of a Canada-Australia mining skills exchange pilot in collaboration with industry stakeholders, academic institutions, and government partners across both countries to address skills and labor shortages that are key to expanding critical minerals production. They are coordinating labor markets, building joint training programs, and creating a unified workforce across two continents for critical minerals extraction and processing. Canada has recently signed 30 new deals with 12 countries for a proposed $12.6 billion of investments in mining and mining technology, taking the total investments to around $18 billion since October. $18 billion in committed mining investments in under 6 months. That is infrastructure being built right now, including mines, processing facilities, and transportation networks. Once operational, those supply chains will not shift easily, and they lock in decades of production aligned with Canadian, Australian strategic priorities, and they are attracting major allies. France backed Canada's model enthusiastically and will advance it as G7 chair. Japan is directing its companies toward Canadian-led rare earth projects. Western nations have been attempting to diversify their supply chains away from China, and the Canada-Australia partnership provides the supply-side foundation for that diversification. For China, this creates a genuine strategic threat. Rare earths have been one of Beijing's few sources of economic leverage over advanced economies. If that leverage disappears because Canada and Australia expand global markets with alternative supply, China loses a geopolitical weapon it cannot easily replace. Beijing will watch this alliance very carefully and will likely respond, whether through accelerated domestic stockpiling, tighter export controls, or economic pressure on countries participating in the Canadian-led network. For the United States, the challenge is more subtle, but equally significant. Washington assumed it would lead Western efforts to counter Chinese mineral dominance. Instead, Canada built an alternative framework that does not require US leadership. From Washington's perspective, the framework is attracting allies who might previously have defaulted to American leadership. France, Japan, Australia, and potentially others are coordinating through Ottawa rather than waiting for direction from Washington. Neither superpower planned for this. China assumed its processing dominance was irreplaceable. The United States assumed allied coordination would always flow through Washington. Canada and Australia just proved both assumptions wrong. And they did it by combining their resource wealth into a partnership that gives them leverage neither could achieve alone. The rare earth empire is not metaphorical. It is operational, and it is reshaping the global balance of power in the industries that will define the 21st century.